We're going to shift to our trending topic, which is JoJo Rabbit. And this is an independent comedy that is out now. It is a film by a director named Taika Waititi. And he is, in some cases, some people might call him a triple threat. He's been involved in directing, including some like big profile films like Thor Ragnarok. He also did a little independent comedy called What We Do in the Shadows about these vampires that all live in a flat together, which I personally just love that movie. And he's also directed and written and is part of Caging Skies. I'm sorry, the movie that is based on the book Caging Skies. It's JoJo Rabbit. It's about a lonely German boy who discovers that his single mother is hiding a Jewish girl in the attic, and he's aided by his imaginary friend Mookie. No, his imaginary friend Adolf Hitler. And JoJo has to confront nationalism as World War II is raging on. It's actually the tail end of World War II. So really what we want to talk about is the psychology of use of really offensive historical characters and historical ideas in comedy. Let me go back and say my first recollection of using Hitler for comedy purposes was The Producers, Mel Brooks. Right?
Mel Brooks.
No. It's got to be Charlie Chaplin, the great dictator.
Oh, right. Of course.
Oh, wow.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, and Hitler was in power at that time. Like, think about that.
That's intense.
Yeah.
That guy was brave.
So we do want to talk about that theme, but before, I just want to get a little roundup of the movie, your take on the movie itself, before we get at kind of these deeper themes of the use of offensive characters, offensive themes for comedic purposes. Whoever saw it, give me your thoughts about your review, your take on the movie.
I'll share. Yeah, I loved it. Honestly, it was this sort of strange, beautifully dark, but also hilarious one-liners movie where it oscillated back and forth between feeling serious and then lighthearted and serious and lighthearted. And that was a delicate dance, I think, to achieve. And there were truthfully some moments where it felt kind of slow, but I stuck with it and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. It was a bit overwhelming for me in that just the juxtaposition of such horror with comedy and actually laughing at Hitler and kind of liking his character, which made me feel really uncomfortable. But I thought the little boy, his acting was unbelievable. And I'm not going to do the spoiler, but Emma Kate and Hedderly and I watched it together, and Emma Kate mentioned something to me pretty early in the film, and I thought, and she nailed it. I don't get how people predict this stuff, but she was exactly right, and it was one of the more upsetting scenes. And the depth of the characters, including some of the German officers, was just, it was complicated and it was beautiful. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think it's got a hard premise that it mostly pulls off. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody didn't like it. I don't think for the subject matter, but just the juggling of tone, because it does go back and forth. And I was fine with that because I looked at the film from the point of view of a 10-year-old boy. But when you think about comedy, it could have been even more brutal from a comedic standpoint. And it could have been more devastating from a dramatic or realism standpoint. So if some people feel like it was a little smoothed over on both sides, like I could get that. I was fine with that. Like I enjoyed it, but it did kind of have some tonal, inconsistencies, or that's just a balancing act.
Yeah. I liked but did not love this movie. I thought if I had to give it a grade, I'd give it a B. It was, in my mind, a good movie with a great performance. I think the kid's performance is one of the best child performances in recent memory. He was fantastic. And by the way, his little buddy with the glasses, the little
So
round
great.
kid, he was also great. I love those.
The little round kid.
They were, sweet boy.
he
No,
little-
they were hilarious.
little
together.
punk.
Well, I mean, the main kid calls him basically a fat,
Yeah,
not
right.
fat friend, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it mostly succeeds. I would say I'd recommend people to see it. I saw it with 3 people. One person said before we even talked, he said, "I don't care what any of you say, I love that movie." Like he wanted to go on record before we started to kind of do our critical stuff. He's like, "I love that movie." I think for me, what I really liked about it was that it was unique and not something I'd seen before. I always give bonus points for that. That's always huge. I think the central performance was really great. I also like some of the supporting performances, like Sam Rockwell and Stephen Merchant. I thought they were terrific. I thought that it was a little bit uneven in tone and just in story progression. So it to me was short of great, but it was good. It was worth seeing. So let's get to the deeper stuff. How do we think about psychologically the use of the worst person of the 20th century for comedic purposes? Because he is being made fun of sort of, but he's also, like Frank said, he is kind of your imaginary friend buddy. He's kind of the fun, he's fun Hitler. And so how's it, tell us a good way to think about this.
Well, Hedderly said it, and I think that's actually the way I look at the film, is through a little boy's eyes. And there's propaganda machine. He doesn't have, knowledge of the world and what's happening or not happening. He's just doing the party line. He doesn't get it. And I think if you look at Hitler through his eyes, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, he's just, a dad that he doesn't have. And he's somebody to talk to. But this is just a quick aside. When the one scene where they walk into the room and it's, see Kyle.
No, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler.
Or Heil Hitler. Heil Hitler.
What did you say?
I don't know. See
Heil
Kyle
Hitler.
is what I
Heil
heard.
Hitler. That was one of my favorite
Yeah,
scenes.
yeah. They had to
But
go
it's
through.
just, I
Everybody
saw-
had to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just saw it as it's almost his father figure, and he's projecting onto him who he wished he could have had.
And to that point, I think this is one of the things that really succeeds in the movie, because Hitler is alternately portrayed as this sort of like fun buddy imaginary character, and then actual Hitler, where he goes on these rants and he gets all worked up. And so it's like you can see this 10-year-old kid trying to synthesize like this public image of Hitler in his speeches and this guy that he wants to impress and to be his buddy. So yeah, I think that part worked really well.
Yeah, I was surprised. I actually really was fairly shocked at seeing some of the footage. And I guess this is maybe a spoiler. I'm not sure. But they show a bunch of footage with Hitler, and they're playing the Beatles as a soundtrack background. And it
It's
was
in German.
wild. But just seeing this perception and representation of Hitler as a pop star almost.
He was.
Well, right. And I mean, when you think about it, like,
I remember it well.
But these people, it was a point in time in history where they were looking for someone to lead them. Granted, they were misguided and uninformed, but I was floored by that. I thought that was really interesting because I'd never really framed it that way, and that made sense. They were really idolizing this person.
And for me, that goes back to our psychology article. I mean, we were the cause of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now we're right back in basically a war with them. We did exactly the same thing to Germany in World War I. It's just they were uninformed, and the more uninformed you are, the less you can kind of participate in the sort of social political process.
Well, one of the things I really appreciate about JoJo Rabbit, and one of the things I really appreciate about humor that pushes the envelope or is offensive, because I really like offensive humor. And those of you that know me, I have an incredible ability to detach from things, to not take things
Shocker.
personally. But I mean, I grew up both being on the receiving end and delivering humor at the expense of Asian culture. And so what we're seeing in film right now is that with call-out culture and cancel culture and representation run amok, is that it has to be universalized to the point where it's propaganda. Like, representation can only happen if it's a universal, positive representation. What I love about this movie is that we know Nazi Germany was responsible for horrific evils. We know Adolf Hitler was responsible for horrific evils. But from the point of view of one 10-year-old German boy at the latter part of World War II who doesn't have all of that history accumulated to inform his worldview and perspective, he wants to belong. He wants to serve his country. He thinks it's the right thing. And you get to see the more that he comes in contact with the horrors of war, that he can now start to like shed some of that blind nationalism and ignorance. But some of that's being exposed to events and horrors, and some of it's actually coming in contact with a real life Jew that, you know, humanizes it. And so I didn't find the movie offensive at all, personally.
No.
Yeah, and I think it does do a nice job with actually tying in moral development, because there's a lot of research out there that talks about how kids, through imagination, through play, they actually explore different moral themes. And so for him to want to dress up as a soldier, to have this imaginary buddy that tells him to do all these crazy things, that's a very standard developmental course.
Mm-hmm. So there is the question, though, is like, can this be, when we're talking about Nazis and Hitler and that sort of thing, is there the risk of using this in such a light way that it minimizes the horror of it? What's your response to that?
I don't think so. I don't think the horror was minimized. I think juxtaposing the two things made it even more horrifying.
They actually brought the horror home in some real ways. So that,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they individualized it and personalized it versus globalize it. And I don't know if I would say that it minimizes it. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, Dave. It's just not the focus. Mm-hmm. That's not the focus of this film. And so can we make art? Can we make pieces of pop culture that involves a German boy, that the focus isn't on him driving it home how evil and horrific the Nazis were? You get that, but that's not the focus of this movie. That's not the central point. And I think that, yes, you can do that. There is nothing wrong with that. If other people are offended, that's their right to respond to this in their own way. But I didn't find anything about this film to be offensive or in poor taste. And again, that's just me.
Yeah, I didn't find it either. I'm just wondering how we're thinking about this. I would also say that you mentioned Charlie Chaplin. I would say Mel Brooks, that those guys would also argue that when you take something like Hitler, the Nazis, and then you co-opt that for comedic purposes, you actually you
take away their power.
Take away their power, right? You don't minimize what they've done, but you kind of, to use a phrase, make them your bitch. You know, you kind of like you take away their power by making fools of them, in a sense. So yeah. Any last thoughts about the psychology of this movie, particularly the use of Nazis, of Hitler, and so on? And any last thoughts?
I feel like the whole message was that it was supposed to be anti-hate, which I thought was beautiful, because really this kid was brainwashed, and here he is coming to know this individual based on which you'll hear all the ridiculous lies about Jewish people from the movie. And it's just really beautiful to see how when you make contact with somebody that's different from you and you have a certain belief about them, you recognize, oh, we're all human.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what the movie to me was. It was humanizing this because you run the risk of dehumanizing Nazism or other horrific people and acts to where it's really easy to dismiss it. Well, they're evil. They're different. They're not like me. They're not like us. And when you humanize real people in those situations, you start to understand how vulnerable they were and how vulnerable anyone can be to shift towards a very evil and dehumanizing perspective and think that you're doing the right thing.
Yep. Good stuff. Well, overall, sounds like we're recommending the movie to you and some good things to think about. Let's shift to our final segment, which is something that we call Doctor's Orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture that we want to recommend to you. Emma Kate.
I am always looking for fun books. So for our YouTube viewers, I'm showing, this is a book called Stuff That Sucks. And it is by Ben Sedley. And basically, it's all about how to accept emotions rather than fight them and move past the negative thoughts and feelings to discover things that really matter to you.
Good stuff. Frank.
I'm going to apologize in advance if we've already recommended this, but I want to recommend Bill Burr's Paper Tiger comedy special on Netflix. It was ridiculously hilarious and speaks to some of our prior podcasts where he just doesn't hold back. And he has one of the best callbacks I've ever seen in a comedy special. That's sort of his last line, and I about lost my mind. So good.
I just have two words: blow up doll. There you'll
Sex robot.
Yep. Yep. There you go.
Oh.
So great.
Jonathan Hedderly.
I am a huge Bob Dylan fan, and his Volume 15 of his bootleg series has been released. It's traveling through the years 1967 to 1969. It's when he reappeared after his motorcycle accident, and he shifted away from impressionistic rock and roll and folk protest music to really more folk and country sound. And he recorded his iconic album, Nashville Skyline. And so this is some of the outtakes and alternative versions. It has some great Johnny Cash tunes that he sings with Johnny Cash. Highly recommend it. Bob Dylan, the bootleg series, Volume 15.
And I was out for the last few podcasts, so I want to ask Jonathan, did you recommend Watchmen while I didn't know if you...
I have not, because... Okay. Only a fool would need my recommendation to be watching The Watchmen. It is ridiculously fantastic.
Mm-hmm. That's my
I'll
recommendation.
Let you recommend it.
I'm recommending it to you. Love it. The first couple episodes are out. If you can pick it up anytime on HBO Go. My new favorite show. Love it.
Yep.
It's just bonkers, crazy. I'm totally in. So I'm recommending Watchmen. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. For Emma Kate Wright and Jonathan Hedderly and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.